Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. And for the next half hour, we're going to be talking about the mysticism of music, among other things. Our guest is Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan, a Sufi who traces his lineage through a long line of Sufi masters. He was born in London, studied philosophy at Oxford University, and studied music in Paris. Then he traveled to the East, where he underwent rigorous training in meditation and other spiritual practices. His father, Inayat Khan, brought Sufism to the West in the early 1900s. Pir Vilayat, his eldest son, is the head of the Sufi order in the West. He directs the Abode of the Message, a spiritual community in upstate New York. What is Sufism?
It's one of the least definable isms in the world. We're not quite sure whether it originates in what century it originates, but I think it is a continuation of the tradition of the Zoroastrian Magi that developed under the aegis of Islam, under the title Sufism. But it's very syncretic. It includes influences from Christian mysticism and Hinduism and Buddhism, and I think even some ancient Egyptian esoteric influence. And there certainly is an influence of the Greek Neoplatonic philosophers, for example.
Are there some practices from any of these traditions that we might be familiar with, the Zoroastrian traditions or any of the other traditions that are common to Sufism today?
Well, I think that possibly the practices with light, which lead to illumination, originate in the Zoroastrian tradition. Working with light and working with one's aura and learning to become luminous and radiant. And also thinking of consciousness as being positive instead of receptive, as being like a ray of light that is cast upon all things.
That isn't the individual's perspective in Sufism?
Yes.
Is that you are a ray of light?
Yes, that's right.
I know that one of the things that was most astounding, amazing to me was the practice of the Zoroastrians. I hope I have this correct in terms of the disposal of the dead. Their bodies were placed on high pillars and consumed
I think
by
it's a
birds.
very wise idea, really. We might one day realize just how very wise it is. In the light of research being made in France by Jean Charron, a physicist, according to whom, since the electrons live eternally, the electrons of the body will continue to live after death, and they're moving in space at the speed of 186,000 miles a second, so that according to the old-fashioned ideas, of course, they couldn't possibly be in communication with one another, but in the new physics, of course, based upon the ERP experiment and Bell's principle, the electrons can be not in communication, but somehow connected by, let's say, in a timeless, spaceless state, and consequently the body may continue to live in a way that we don't know, of course, in a very different mode to the usual one, the one that is familiar to us. But there may be something to say for the survival of the body, and therefore all the old ideas about resurrection, which are to be found, of course, in Zoroastrianism. And it is very well possible that these ideas found their way in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. At the time, as you know, at the time of Cyrus, when the Emperor Cyrus, when the Jews were freed from Babylon, and that time there was a transfer of a lot of ideas from the Persians into the Jewish tradition.
What does a Sufi do?
Well, this whole thing about Sufism is trying to find a way of bringing spirituality into everyday life. And therefore, in that sense, I think it does contrast with many of the Eastern esoteric schools, which have their origin in an ascetic way of life, and which might lead to otherworldliness, whether we are trying to find a way of introducing spirituality into everyday life. So there's no need to live as a celibate and no need to live as an ascetic. In fact, it is even frowned upon by the tradition of the Sufis. But, of course, I do admit that it is really very, very difficult to keep one's attunement in the middle of the hustle, bustle, and rat race of everyday life. So I find that it's important to carry out a retreat from time to time, and that means really getting out of life for a time and then getting back right into it with a bang.
So you would say Sufis do pretty much what a whole lot of other people do, but they have a different system of beliefs, ideals?
Well, I don't like the word belief myself. I'm sorry, but I would say I like to think in terms of experience. No, I think that, of course, it's true. There's a metaphysics behind it, and it is exactly the opposite of the usual way of thinking. Instead of the human being being the subject who experiences, the experiencing subject, it is God who is the subject, and the human being is the means through which the only being experiences himself, and the human being is also the object. So actually, if I may quote an old hadith in the Quran, upon which I must say that many of the Sufi ideas are based, it says, I was a hidden treasure, God speaking, I was a hidden treasure and desired to be known, and therefore, now this is my commentary on the subject. Okay. And therefore I have become, in the consciousness of all beings, the subject of my self-discovery, and I have become, in the personality of all beings, the object of my self-discovery. So it's all one being, but there's a dichotomy within this being between the subject and the object, and both of them are also his being, both the subject and the object. So, according to Sufis, of course, you mustn't think of God as being a being up there with a big beard, but everything is God everywhere. So one might say it's kind of a form of pantheism. I know it has been accused, Sufism has often been accused of being pantheistic. It's all one being, that's what one means by God, and in fact one indivisible reality. And as you know, this is one of the latest views of physicists in our time, that you cannot divide the totality of the universe, because every fraction of in as much as you can speak about a fraction of the universe, it carries within it the potentiality of the total universe. And that's absolutely within the views of the Sufis.
Let's talk about sound if we can. We shift gears here a little bit.
Sure.
In what way is sound mystical?
Well, I like to refer to the old metaphysics of the Sufis. Of course, the origin of all physical reality is pure vibration, which is, of course, wave-like. So let's say the ultimate nature of reality is wave-like. The beauty of sound is that, of course, every so-called object in the world has a signature tune, and who knows the signature tune of the objects is able to cause them to start resonating and cause, therefore, an interference pattern, some communication, and therefore it's the key to experience and relationship. And this is borne out, again, if I may talk about modern science, by experiments that were made by Dr. Becker in the Columbia University Presbyterian Medical Center, where they're healing people from fractured bones, for example, regenerating encouraging the regenerative process by placing the bones in electromagnetic field, in a coil, for example. Mm-hmm. And now they have found that, of course, the key to it all is, of course, the frequency of the field. And therefore, once again, of course, it's the signature tune of that particular tissue. You can make a catalogue of the different signature tunes of the different tissues of the body. In the same way, we're working with sound, Sufis are working with sound, what we call a mantra, placing sound in different centers, like the heart center, for example, solar plexus, third eye, crown center. And you can imagine what happens to the cells of the body when they are exposed to being bombarded by a definite frequency of sound, which they react to, of course, in a certain way. It transforms the structure of the even the electrons and the atoms within the molecules, and quite apart from the psychological effect, of course, which is quite incredible. I could give an example of some of the sounds that we're using, if you like.
I would like that very much.
For example, ya ka power, divine power. Pure spirit. The kind of outpouring of the many splendid bounty, divine bounty in all beings. So it's a kind of ongoing, just like the flow of Ganges, for example. The opening of a door. Fatah! Sorry, have a shock.
Popped a few eardrums there. Those of you listening with your headsets at home will appreciate it.
That is the practice of the night. Imagine the night kneeling in the chapel throughout the night, promising to serve the hierarchy of the masters. It's that thing. And then as the dawn comes, of course, there's a door opens and he or she, of course, has a view into new perspectives. And that's fatah. It's a word that's unfortunately been misused by terrorists in our time, as you know, the Fatah movement, so we don't like talking about it too much in public. That's exactly what I'm doing.
You made reference to mantra, and I think for many people who don't have a personal experience with the concept of mantra, it is a sound that directs the mind or the spirit to a higher plane. It is a repeating sound that makes them think about something or puts them in a certain frame of mind. But you talked about it as a physical vibration.
Yes.
To a specific
I mean,
portion of the
I'm
body.
sure there are several aspects of the problem. I think to start with, we have to think of the effect on the body. Incidentally, just imagine if you were to pinpoint a certain location in the brain, for example, a pituitary or the pineal, and keep on placing a mantra in that particular point, like, for example, it would be a very sharp point, like the mantra Alim. Alim. Imagine you place that sound, concentrate on a particular point in the brain, you would be able to release, for example, hormones of the pituitary gland, endorphins, for example, that have an effect, as you know, on the psyche of the person. I'm thinking of that in those terms, but of course, it's true the mantra is used, for example, in transcendental meditation, in a way. I think it is a way of maintaining a certain attunement, so that as the people are allowed to let their thoughts stray. There's always a danger that when the mind should go right absolutely amok, you could sort of open up a whole hell of demonic ideas from the unconscious, for example. And the mantra maintains one certain high attunement. In that case, it's a very useful thing. But I'm thinking of the mantra not only in terms of the individual, but also in terms of establishing communication with the universe, because one is sending out sound into the universe, which immediately calls for replies, so that the sound is boomerang back to one. And in fact, I think part of the mantra is to listen in rather than just produce a sound. And when one does so, then I must say I can't say that one hears. I think it's a different, that's why I use the word listen in instead of listening. I think what happens is one vibrates at a rate which is in tune, in resonance with the feedback that one is receiving, which is not exactly the same as the sound that one produced to start with. There's some kind of a processing that takes place. It's a little bit like sounding, like a radar, for example. And that's, of course, one of the most amazing things that can happen in a retreat, but one would have to go into a very deep state in a retreat to be able to feel out what's happening as one sends sound out into the universe.
Does every individual naturally resonate with some sort of a mantra?
Of course.
Do we?
I mean, even just physically, of course, as you know, every electron, every atom, every molecule is vibrating, or at least is in a state of potential vibration, like a gong, for example. As soon as you give it a certain amount of energy, whether it's blowing on it or heating it or banging it, of course, immediately it starts vibrating. But, of course, these vibrations are more or less integrated. And, of course, the better integrated they are, the more harmonious the person is psychologically, of course. It's very often if a person is out of tune, well, then, of course, one could probably, I think there will be a day when we'll be able to detect exactly in the physical body why there's a lack of synchronism between the vibrations. Perhaps you know that there's a phenomena in chemistry called protein conformation. It means that if the vibrations of the cells are harmonious, they occupy less space. It's like when you're packing your luggage. If you have your books, they're all very nicely worked out. You can put more books in that place, that amount of place, so that this is what happens in the nervous system. The nerves get beautifully kind of coordinated by the mind, you see, and otherwise, of course, you can find yourself in a chaotic state. I hope I'm apologizing for. I apologize for referring so much to physics and biology, but I think that this is the holistic way of looking at things in our time.
I think our listeners will find it very refreshing. If, in fact, we can accept that every individual is a combination of different vibrations on the chemical level and on the spiritual level, a symphony, is it possible that we can identify a universal sound? And perhaps that's what the mantras and the examples that you gave earlier are, but is it possible, I'm thinking of a small booth that would have certain vibrations or sounds in them, that we could go and close the door and be in that booth for a little while and absorb this sound and come out tuned, kind of a tune-up center?
I'm afraid that's a simplistic solution. I think, with all due respect, the vibrational pattern of each person is totally different. And there, I spoke about the, let's say, the harmony between the vibrations within the same individual, but of course one has to also consider the relationship between the symphony, let's say, or synchronism of the individual with the environment and perhaps even the whole universe. So it's not that simple, but it is true that the mantra makes one very sensitive to sound, to the effect of sound vibration. And there are some gurus, like, for example, Sant Kirpal Singh, who deprecated the repetition of mantras because he said that by so doing one is prefiguring what would happen if one were to listen in. We listen in, as I say, but we first say the mantras. According to him, it's better just to listen in and not produce your own sound, because then you won't be open to the sounds that you'll be receiving from the universe. I'm not quite of that opinion, because I find that by producing the sounds, at least according to our methods, one becomes very sensitized to sound, and then one can just totally reverse things and become totally receptive.
How do you find out what your individual sound or sounds are? How do you get in touch with those?
Well, I'm sure that repeating mantras, you have a feedback, like you're able to hear what is really within you. In fact, that's what it is. It's really a feedback system.
You have the advantage of having been educated in the West and then having been educated in the East, and so you can see both sides of the coin. I'm wondering if you could tell us what the ancient cultures knew about sound that we don't know, or perhaps that we might rediscover.
Yes, you see, I belong to a country where esoteric knowledge is maintained very, very secret, and even, my great-grandfather was one of the greatest singers in India, and in those days they never taught, the Hindus would never communicate their knowledge of ragas to a Muslim. And he was the first one, he was of a Muslim family, he was the first one who was graced by a guru who would, a pandit, who accepted, an ustad as they say, who accepted to teach him the Indian ragas. So this knowledge has been kept very confidential, and I'm afraid that a lot of it may have got lost in the course of time. But sound has been used to produce physical effects, like, for example, there's a famous story of the Indian singer Tansen in the time of under the rule of Emperor Akbar, who the emperor asked him to sing the raga of fire at a certain time of the day when one isn't supposed to sing it. And since it was an order of the emperor, he had to do it. And he said, it's at your risk, because I'm contravening the rules of our tradition. And immediately he did it. The palace set on fire. So it was kind of, well, of course, as you know, one can break a glass by producing the right sound corresponding to the particular formation of glass. And so, of course, there's no doubt that the action of sound is far beyond what we can be or could be, especially when one produces pure sound, because our usual languages are conventional. That is, we agree that table means table and so on. But the mantram, the thing about mantram is that one is using sounds that belong to an original language based upon cosmic principles. Now, I'll give you an example of it. For example, most people don't know this, of course, the word, the Atlantean word, Azatar, Atlantis. Now, that's the origin of the word astrology or asteroid or whatever, astral and so on. You have three vowels here. Consonants: A-S, A-T, A-R. A-S for water, S, which is obviously the sound of water, T, which is the sound of fire, R, the sound of earth. So it is a planet of water, fire, and earth. And so it is actually the name of planet Earth. Now, so these words, as I say, so here's a case where it's very clear that the sounds correspond to the actual whatever they're standing for. And that's the secret of sound. That's why the mantram is not the same thing repeating cheese, 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 and repeating kudus, for example.
Let's talk about the similarities and differences in approach to sound and specifically sacred music in the East and the West. For example, Gregorian chants.
Mm.
Is there some universal significance to Gregorian chant? In their simplicity, is there a value in the East as well as the West?
Yes. As you know, Indian music, of course, does not, except quite recently, of course, does not go into harmonies, chords, and so on and so forth. Just simply a melody, a sequence of sounds, and that was, of course, that was the state of affairs in the Gregorian chant. Also, the choice of, the Gregorian chants are based upon ragas, not exactly the kind of scales that are used, that were used since then by Joan Bach and so on, Beethoven. And some of those mantrams are very similar to the Indian ragas. The effect is very soothing and brings one into a spiritual tune. If you'd like, I can sing to you an Indian raga, for example, that would is rather similar to the to the Gregorian. It's a song that was a melody that was sung by my great-grandfather, Mm-hmm. You see, the effect of it immediately soothes you down when it is so rushing all the time and gets so excited. And I think it's very good if occasionally one can just drop everything and sing something like that just to get into it.
I found the interesting thing is that even though I had never heard it before, I was able to anticipate some of the notes because there seemed to be some familiarity there.
Yes, something organic about it. Yeah.
What makes music sacred? Is it the singer, the player, the listener, the music itself, the intention of the occasion, the place where it's played?
I must say, you see, listening to, for example, music of Victoria, that was, 16th century or something like that in Spain, the height of polyphony. Well, Victoria was a monk. If you listen to that music, you realize that music, I mean, as sublime as this, could only have been composed by a person who spent all his life living in the glory of God. It's an expression of a very deep attunement. You can't just sit down and write music like that. It corresponds to a certain attunement that most people have lost in our time. Fortunately, there's a little something of it remaining. But these are the valuable things in life.
A final question. Would you like to teach the world to sing? There was a pop song that I think went around the world a few years back. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. Would that make an impact in terms of the global peace effort and some of the other things that we're all hoping for, waiting for?
Well, of course. I mean, I don't have any pretension about teaching. But I must say that if I could speak in the language of music rather than the awful conventional languages we're using, I would feel delighted indeed. One of my greatest regrets in life, I suppose, is because I did give up music. But it is a regret in one way, and because I started as a musician. But on the other hand, I realized that, of course, people in the West particularly need to have ideas clarified and so on. I'm wondering now, of course, as I get older, I'm beginning to wonder just how useful it is in the end, whether it wouldn't be much more dynamic if one were to communicate simply in music. In fact, my father said that the music, the message that is the religion of the future, he said, will be music.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.